Sure, here's the first part of your terrifying retelling of the Ballad of Black Tom. The old tenement on 144th Street had always felt wrong, but Charles Thomas Tester knew better than to question the pull of a good hustle. The city was a hungry thing, and a black man had to be clever to survive its gnashing jaws. He carried his guitar case, not for the music, but for the weight inside. Sometimes books, sometimes something sharper. Today, it held a small, leather-bound volume, its cover worn by hands that had no business touching it. He had taken the job for money, nothing more. The old woman in Flatbush had been insistent. "Deliver this to Mr. Sidham, and don't open it." Simple enough, but the book pulsed under his fingers like something alive. He had never been the superstitious type, yet the moment he left her crumbling brownstone, he felt eyes on him. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the shifting shadows of Brooklyn at dusk. The train ride into Manhattan was worse. The book radiated heat through the fabric of his coat, and he swore he could hear it breathing. The usual clatter of the subway seemed muted, as if the city itself held its breath. A drunk sat slumped in the corner, mumbling nonsense to himself. But every now and then, Tester could swear he caught a familiar phrase. "The sleeper stirs, the gate will open, let the darkness sing." By the time he reached Sweetham's mansion in Red Hook, the streetlights flickered like dying candles. The house loomed over him, its windows like empty eyes. He knocked once, twice. The door creaked open before his knuckles met wood a third time. A figure emerged from the gloom inside. Tall, gaunt, draped in an old-fashioned coat. Robert Sidham. His skin was waxen, stretched too tight over his bones, and his eyes, they gleamed with something that made Tester's gut twist. "You have it," Sweetham whispered. Tester nodded, but his hands wouldn't move. He didn't want to let go of the book, but he didn't want to keep it either. Something about it had latched on to him. His fingers burned where they touched the leather. Sidham extended a long, pale hand, and the moment he took the book, the temperature in the room dropped. "Do you know what you've brought me, Mr. Tester?" Sidham's voice was smooth like silk over rot. "I don't ask questions," Tester said, stepping back. Sweetham smiled. "Ah, but the questions are already asking you." The words made no sense, but they sank deep, coiling in Tester's mind. He wanted to leave, to put distance between himself and this place, but his feet wouldn't move. Something in the darkness behind Sweetham shifted. A shape, a suggestion of something vast, writhing, waiting. And then from the depths of the house, a sound slithered through the air, low, wet, and hungry. Tester's breath hitched. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something deeper, something that made his bones feel too tight in his skin. He wanted to run, but his legs had turned to stone. Sidham, still holding the book, tilted his head as if listening to some secret whisper. The shadows behind him pulsed, thick and oily, shifting in ways shadows shouldn't move. "Would you like to hear the song, Mr. Tester?" Sweetham asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deal in music no more," Tester muttered, his voice dry in his throat. Sweetham chuckled, a hollow sound that carried no real amusement. "Oh, but you do. You carry the notes inside you. You walk the rhythm every day. You don't even know how close you are to the melody." The words slithered into Tester's head, wrapping around his thoughts like vines. The air in the mansion grew heavy, pressing against his skin, thick with something unseen. He forced himself to step back, to tear his gaze away from Sweetham's burning eyes, but as he turned, he saw something in the doorway. A shape. It was just a trick of the dim light, he told himself. A shadow cast by the flickering lamps outside. But then it moved. It stepped forward. Tester's breath stilled. It was tall, taller than any man should be, its form bending the air around it. Its edges shimmered, uncertain, shifting between shapes too fast for the eye to catch. He saw limbs that shouldn't be there. Fingers too long, ending in points that curled like hooks. It had no face, but somehow he knew it was looking at him. And then, it spoke. Not in words, not in any language he had ever heard, but in sound. Deep, droning, vibrating through his skull like 1,000 voices speaking at once. It wasn't meant for human ears. It was something older, something meant for the darkness itself. His stomach lurched, nausea rolling through him like a wave. The walls of the mansion rippled, as if the world itself were folding in. Sweetham remained still, watching, smiling. "It knows you now," Sweetham murmured. "It sees you." Tester's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't come here for this," he growled, trying to keep his voice steady. But you did, Sidum said. You always would have. There are no accidents, Mr. Tester, only invitations. The shadow thing shifted, stretching, its outline blurring, growing taller, wider, filling the space. A sound rumbled from its core, hungry, eager. Tester's skin crawled, his body screaming at him to flee. Then the thing reached for him. Tester finally found his legs and staggered back, crashing through the door into the cold air of the night. He didn't stop, didn't look back. But as he ran, he knew one thing for certain. That thing had seen him, and it would not forget. Tester ran until his legs burned, until the cold night air stabbed his lungs like knives. The city streets felt unfamiliar, the familiar hum of Harlem distant, muted, as if he had stepped into another version of the world, one where the shadows stretched too long and the air carried whispers just beneath the surface. His mind screamed at him to forget, to bury the memory of what he had seen in Sidum's mansion. But he knew better. He had been marked. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against him, tracking his every step. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see the shifting thing looming behind him, but there was nothing. Just the endless sprawl of the city, its streets slick with mist, its alleys yawning like open mouths. He told himself he was being paranoid. Shadows were just shadows. And yet, the streetlights above flickered as he passed, one by one. A cat, hunched in the alley, hissed at something behind him, its fur bristling. His hands trembled as he shoved them into his coat pockets, his fingers brushing against the worn wood of the guitar case slung over his shoulder. He had always carried it for protection, but tonight it felt like a lifeline. He reached his apartment in Harlem, slamming the door shut behind him, locking it, bolting it, pressing his back against the wood. His heart pounded, his pulse roaring in his ears. He was safe. He had to be. But then the air changed. The silence stretched too long. The dim light of his lamp cast strange shapes against the walls. Something was wrong. He turned slowly. His reflection in the dusty mirror across the room should have been familiar, but it wasn't. The man staring back at him had his face, his clothes, his exhaustion, but his eyes were not his own. They were too dark, too deep. And when Tester lifted his hand to his face, the reflection didn't move. A breath, ragged, rasping, escaped the mirror. Not his. His stomach nodded. The thing in the glass grinned, its teeth wrong, too sharp, too many. The grin stretched wider, cracking the skin at the corners, and then it whispered. "It knows you." Tester stumbled backward, his heel catching the edge of his worn rug, sending him crashing to the floor. The impact jarred him, but he didn't take his eyes off the mirror. The reflection remained where it was, its grin stretching impossibly wide. Then, without warning, it took a step forward, not in the mirror, into the room. The glass didn't shatter, the surface rippled like water as the thing, his double, his shadow, emerged, unfolding itself with unnatural grace. The air turned thick, heavy with something ancient and foul, and the grin never faded. Tester's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the thing stepped fully into the room. His mind rejected what he was seeing. His own face twisted into something unnatural, something hungry. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs bending just a little too fluidly, like it wasn't used to the body it was wearing. The grin stretched wider, and then it spoke again. "It knows you now." The voice was his, but hollow, layered with something else, something old and rotting. It was as if 100 voices whispered beneath the surface of his own, curling around his thoughts like smoke. Tester scrambled backward, his hands searching for anything solid, anything real. His fingers brushed against the guitar case. Instinct took over. He grabbed it, swung it in a wide arc. The thing didn't move, didn't flinch. The case struck its side with a dull thud, but instead of flesh and bone, it was like hitting something far less solid, something shifting and formless beneath a paper-thin skin. The impact sent a tremor through its shape, distorting it for just a moment before it reformed. And then it laughed. Tester had never heard a sound so wrong. It was his laugh, but stretched, warped, as if something else inside it was learning how to mimic him, how to be him. "You shouldn't have looked," the thing said, tilting its head. "You shouldn't have listened." Tester gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand back, forcing his knees to stop shaking. "I don't know what you are, but you sure as hell ain't me." The thing's grin faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Then its mouth, too wide, too dark, opened, and the whisper came again. He is watching. Tester didn't wait. He lunged for the door, yanking it open so hard it nearly tore from the hinges. He stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind him. He expected to hear footsteps following, the creak of wood, the rustle of movement. But there was nothing. Silence. Too much silence. The city was never quiet. Not at this hour, not in Harlem, not anywhere. There should have been the distant honk of cars, the murmur of voices, the hum of life. But all he heard was his own ragged breathing. Tester turned, heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the doors on either side seeming further away than they should be. The dim light buzzed and flickered, casting jittery shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Then, from behind the door to his apartment, the whisper slithered out once more. He is coming. And this time, it wasn't just his own voice. There were others. Tester backed away from his door, his legs stiff with fear. The voices inside weren't just whispering anymore. They were chanting, low, rhythmic, layered. They spoke no language he recognized, yet the meaning crawled into his mind, unwelcome, unavoidable. He wasn't meant to hear these words. Something was waking. The hallway stretched longer, the walls pressing inward, suffocating. The single bare light bulb overhead flickered wildly, casting his shadow in jagged, shifting angles. It felt like the walls themselves were breathing. Then the knob on his door turned, slowly. The voices behind it surged, rising to a fever pitch. Tester didn't stay to see what would step through. He ran. His footsteps echoed too loud against the warped wooden floor, a hollow thud-thud that didn't sound like his own. He turned corners blindly, taking stairs two at a time, his chest burning. He burst through the front door of the building and into the freezing Harlem night. The city should have comforted him. The neon hum of late-night bars, the distant wail of a saxophone drifting from a window above. But it didn't, because the silence was wrong. Even the night air felt dead. Tester kept moving, turning down side streets, cutting through alleys, trying to shake the feeling of unseen eyes, but he could feel it. A weight in the air. A presence just behind his shoulder. Something was following, not footsteps, not a shadow. Something else. A pressure. A pulling sensation, like an unseen string had been tied around his ribs, dragging him back. He stopped beneath a flickering street lamp, panting, sweat slicking his forehead despite the cold. He had to think, had to figure out what the hell was happening. And then, across the street, he saw them. A group of men, standing perfectly still in the dim light. No, not men. Figures. They wore long coats, their faces obscured by the brims of old hats, their hands tucked into their pockets. They didn't move, didn't shift. Just watched. Tester's skin crawled. He took a step back, and the figures took a step forward in unison. His pulse pounded. He turned sharply down an alley, his breath hitching, his hands clenching into fists. He had to get out. Had to wake up. But the alley wasn't empty. A single man stood at the far end, blocking his path. Tall. Gaunt. Robert sighed him. "You're running from something you cannot escape," Sidem murmured, his voice almost kind. "You've seen it, and now it sees you." Tester took another step back. "I don't want nothing to do with this." Sidem only smiled. "It's far too late for that, Mr. Tester." And from behind him the whisper came again. "He is here." Tester spun around, but the alley behind him was empty. The whisper had come from nowhere. No, not nowhere. Everywhere. The air itself carried the sound, vibrating with something ancient, something hungry. His pulse pounded in his ears. Sidem stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Why do you run, Mr. Tester?" Tester's grip on his guitar case tightened. "Because I got sense," he snapped. "And because I know when something ain't meant to be seen." Sidem chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Wow, but you did see, didn't you? And now you belong to it." Tester took another step back, but the alley seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally. The street beyond felt impossibly distant, like a dream slipping away. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, against his lungs. Something moved in the shadows. Not a person, not an animal, something else. The darkness itself twisted, shapes slithering through it, shifting between human and not human. "I don't belong to nobody," Tester growled, forcing himself to stay steady. "And I damn sure don't belong to it." Sidem's smile widened. "You think you still have a choice?" And then, behind him, the figures stepped into the alley. The men in the long coats. Their faces were still obscured, but now Tester could see why. They didn't have faces. Beneath the brims of their hats, there was nothing but smooth, empty skin. No eyes, no mouths, just a featureless stretch of flesh where their faces should have been. Tester's stomach twisted. The figures moved forward in perfect, silent unison. He turned to run, only to find Sidem standing impossibly close, his cold hand pressing against Tester's chest. Tester felt it then. The thing inside the book. The thing in the mansion. The thing in the mirror. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. And now it had found a door. "You don't have to fight it," Sidem murmured. "You could embrace it, become something more." Tester shoved him back, his breath ragged. "I ain't interested." Sidem sighed, almost disappointed. "You will be." The air in the alley rippled. The walls pulsed, the bricks seeming to breathe. The faceless men stepped closer, and from the darkness something reached for him. A hand, not human, not solid, but vast and shifting, its fingers stretching longer than they should, curling around him, pulling him down. Tester opened his mouth to scream, but the alley vanished. The city vanished. Everything vanished, and he fell. Not through air, through something else entirely. The fall was endless. Tester wasn't plummeting through air, he was sinking through nothingness. The world around him was black, but not like night, not like shadow. It was absence. A void where light had never existed. He couldn't tell if he was moving fast or if he was simply being swallowed whole, devoured by the very fabric of whatever lay beyond the world he knew. And worst of all, he wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness. Not things he could see, not fully, but he felt them. The weight of their presence, pressing against his skin, coiling through his thoughts. They whispered, but not in words. Their voices scraped against the inside of his skull, drilling into his mind like fingers searching for something deep inside him. He clenched his teeth, gripping his guitar case tighter. It was all he had left, the only thing tethering him to himself. His father had taught him that this case, this weight, was his anchor, his shield against the world. And now, in this place that had no ground, no sky, no meaning, he held onto it like a drowning man grasping a floating scrap of wood. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the falling stopped. Tester landed hard, but not on solid ground. It was soft, like flesh, like something breathing. The moment his hands pressed against it, it pulsed beneath his fingers. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged. The ground beneath him wasn't stone, wasn't earth. It was alive. Veins pulsed beneath its surface, moving to some slow, ancient rhythm. He forced himself to look up, to take in his surroundings, and he wished he hadn't. The sky above wasn't a sky at all. It was an eye, vast, unblinking. The pupil stretched across the horizon, blacker than the space between stars, and it was looking right at him. Tester's stomach twisted, his body locking up as something deep inside him, something primal, understood. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't madness. He had fallen into the gaze of something older than time itself. And then it spoke, not with words, not with sound. It pressed into him, into his thoughts, into his bones. His skin burned, his mind stretched, pulled apart, and put back together all at once. "You are seen." The force of the thought sent Tester to his knees. His ears rang, his vision blurred. He gasped, trying to hold on to himself, onto who he was. No, he wouldn't let this thing take him. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the wood of his guitar case so tight his knuckles ached. He focused on its weight, on the feel of it. He focused on his father's voice, on the sound of old jazz floating through Harlem nights. He would not be lost. But then the voice came again. "You will sing for me?" Tester's body locked up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands trembled against the worn wood of his guitar case, but he held on. Whatever this thing was, this eye, this voice, it wanted something from him. "You will sing for me." The words weren't heard, weren't spoken. They were imprinted into his mind, burned into his bones like a brand. Tester gritted his teeth, shaking his head. "I don't sing no more," he growled, his voice hoarse. The world around him shuddered. The fleshy ground beneath his feet pulsed harder, as if irritated, as if the thing that was this place did not like his answer. The sky eye above did not blink, did not shift, but the pressure in the air grew heavier, pressing down on him like the weight of an ocean. "You carry the notes, you walk the rhythm, you will play." Tester forced himself to his feet, legs shaking. He had no idea how to fight something like this, something that wasn't flesh and blood, something that existed beyond the rules of the world he knew. But he did know one thing. It wanted him to play. and he had never played for no one but himself. His fingers tightened around the handle of his case. His father had always told him there was power in music, that sound was something alive, something that could command. Maybe, just maybe, it worked both ways. With slow, deliberate movements, he unlatched the case, the familiar creak of the hinges grounding him for just a moment. The guitar inside was old but well cared for, its strings worn from years of use. It had been his father's once, before it was his, and now he was about to play for something not of this world. He strummed a chord, low, deep, the vibration rippling through the space around him. The air itself shivered as if caught off guard. He played another, his fingers moving instinctively, the rhythm growing. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was feeling, and for the first time since he had fallen into this nightmare, the eye reacted. The ground tensed. The sky seemed to flinch. The weight pressing against him lessened, if only slightly. Tester grinned through his fear. "You wanted a song?" he muttered. "Then you better listen." He played harder, faster. His fingers danced across the strings, pouring every ounce of defiance, every scrap of Harlem Street's soul into the music. The sound grew, filling the endless space. And the eye began to quake. A new sound rose, a deep, agonized groan, as if the world itself was protesting. The veins beneath his feet spasmed, the darkness around him cracking. Tester didn't know what would happen if he kept playing, but he sure as hell wasn't going to stop now.